Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Sam Rockwell leads a starry voice cast in the DreamWorks Animation Heist flick, The Bad Guys. Mr. Wolf, voiced by Sam Rockwell, leads a group of animal thieves, including Safecracker Mr. Snake, voiced by Marc Maron, Hacker Miss Tarantula, voiced by Awkwafina, Master of Disguise Mr. Shark, voiced by Craig Robinson, and Muscle Mr. Piranha, voiced by Anthony Ramos, and a series of heists across LA, managing to evade Police Chief Misty Luggins, voiced by Alex Borstein. But the team are finally caught when they try to steal a humanitarian award to be presented to Professor Marmalade, voiced by Richard Ayoade, who convinces Governor Diane Foxington, played by Zazie Beetz, to allow him the chance to rehabilitate them. But will these bad guys use their skills to do good instead of be the villains, or is Mr. Wolf working on a con? The Bad Guys is based on the highly successful children's book series of the same name, which launched in 2015 by Australian actor-turned-author Aaron Blabey. I believe at the time of this video there are now 15 books in that series, so there's loads of material to be mined to be turned into sequels should DreamWorks want to expand this out into a franchise, which I suspect they very much do. And I believe the film is roughly based on the first 2 books or so, but there are fairly significant changes, like the fact that Mr. Tarantula is now Miss Tarantula in the film incarnation. Blabey was actually involved with the film version, and he's credited as an executive producer. The books were adapted to the screen by Ethan Cohen, who has previously worked with DreamWorks Animation on Madagascar 2. He's also worked on movies like Tropic Thunder and the absolutely dreadful Holmes and Watson, which I presume he was licking his wounds from a few years ago. The film is also the feature directorial debut of French director Pierre Perifel, who has really risen through the ranks of DreamWorks Animation. He's been with them for the last decade, often serving as an animation director on various films, usually with specific characters. He was also associated with the cancelled Larrikins project, which got reconfigured into the short film Bilby, which he directed a few years ago. And I think you can tell right from the outset that Perifel brings a very different sensibility to this movie, certainly for the studio, because honestly, The Bad Guys feels like the freshest DreamWorks animated movie in a very long time. The first thing that immediately hits you about The Bad Guys is that it has such a strong sense of style. Perifel was clearly going for a cool but cute kind of vibe, and that's exactly the aesthetic that he manages to land, in large part because it feels so confident and self-assured. There's not a lot of animated films that look like this one. This is a very distinctive looking movie, and right away that gives the film a sense of personality, and in general the movie feels like it kind of has a little bit of an attitude, a little bit of an edge to it. Obviously not enough to feel unsafe. This is a U-certificate children's movie after all, but even so, the film is distinctly pulling from the tropes of heist movies and crime flicks. It reminds me a lot of Zootopia, or Zootropolis as it was known in the UK. That borrowed a lot from cop dramas and detective stories. There's a lot of noir elements in Zootopia, but it's in the guise of a family-friendly animated film. And The Bad Guys does exactly the same thing for the caper flick. To use an imagery that's actually in the movie itself, it is a wolf in sheep's clothing, or a wolf in a sheep's onesie, in actual fact, in that it takes the tropes and conventions of a genre normally aimed at more mature adult audiences and puts them in a palatable, family-friendly guise. And that means there's plenty for older audiences as well, especially if they're fans of the Heist movie, who will very quickly realise that this is a love letter to that kind of film. So many of its trademarks are replicated wholesale and deliberately here, like the fact that it's set in LA, like so many heist and crime films are, to the car chases, the safe cracking, our team of wisecracking thieves that each have their individual roles to play, very much like Ocean's 11. In some ways, it feels like the animated equivalent of something like Edgar Wright's Baby Driver, which itself was very much knowing about caper movie tropes, but also it incorporates numerous visual shorthands that we associate with the subgenre, like the fact that the movie uses split screens, which have been very much a mainstay of heist films ever since their pioneering use in the 60s version of the Thomas Crown Affair. You don't think of a heist movie without a sequence where you see various members of the team working together in various sections of the screen, but that is also a good example of how the movie takes those conventions and then expands upon them in terms of its animation and its visual style, because what else is separated into panels like that? Comic books. And there's a lot of the bad guys that looks like a comic book or a storybook panel. Perifel mentioned that he was very much inspired by Into the Spiderverse, and I think you can definitely see that in the results here. One of the great things about Into the Spiderverse is that it gave American animation teams permission to start experimenting with the form again in ways they hadn't for literally decades. Be animated. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that now. The Bad Guys looks very different to that movie, but it applies many of the same principles as Spiderverse, especially in combining 2D and 3D techniques simultaneously to create something that is at once unique, but also feels very pleasingly modern and old-fashioned simultaneously, which makes sense for a film which harkens back to heist movie tropes that go all the way back to the 60s. The movie looks absolutely gorgeous. At times it is incredibly visually inventive. It gripped me right from the outset because it is so brilliantly animated all throughout, and the way that it just holds its conviction with its style is what makes the film just so cool to look at. Obviously, at a base level, it is a 3D animated film with the standard models and everything, but the 2D elements is what gives it a sense of real personality to it. Say, the 2D smoke that's incorporated at a lower, different frame rate, or the speed lines to amplify motion, or just the fact that the character models have a hand-drawn outline around them. That is what gives them their detail. And you can even see this with the character designs, which have a lot of 2D principles applied to them, in that they are very simple and easy to read, especially for children, but also have very distinctive flourishes about them, like the sharp white suits that Mr. Wolf wears, very heist movie-esque, to Diane Foxington's eyebrow piercing, which is a very deliberate character design detail. And so, as an overall visual look, the movie is the best of both worlds. It has the flexibility and depth of 3D, and the expressiveness and action of 2D. And the heist movie elements and the animation go hand in hand with each other. They feed off of each other and influence the way the film is stylized. There are several moments where the animators pay homage to the heist movie that push the form, especially right from the outset. The movie opens with a oneer, which is unusual in an animated film in of itself, in that it opens with a diner scene. Perifel has mentioned that there are several nods to Pulp Fiction and Tarantino all throughout the movie, and this is the first of them because it's meant to be a nod to the opening of Pulp Fiction, but it's also a nod to the fact that Pulp Fiction was nodding to various other heist movies that opened with scenes of characters talking in diners facing against the bank that they're about to rob. And so this sequence is about 2.5 minutes long. It starts with them just simply talking at a table, and then it goes into a quite complicated camera move as we move around the diner and see the terrified patrons all just watching on in fear, cowering, while Mr. Snake and Mr. Wolf are just chatting away and laughing to themselves. And then we pull out onto the street as they walk through it. In fact, that whole opening robbery and subsequent car chase that introduces the title characters is an animation tour de force. What Perifel and his team have created is so dynamic. The way the camera moves and crash zooms, the way it cuts is so crisp. There is a rhythm to it. It's so popping and lively and colourful. It'll really hold kids' attention. It feels like you're watching the most fun parts of a heist movie, but with the sensibilities of a storybook. And that way, it feels like it's respectful to the source material and to its origins, while also doing its own thing. And I think you can see all this influence throughout the entire movie in various different sequences. Later, there is a dance sequence between Foxington and Mr. Wolf, and again, they use live action reference for that, but of course, they push it beyond that. They push it into an animated realm and doing impossible moves, and that The sequence very much feels like it's indebted to the famous John Travolta Uma Thurman dance in Pulp Fiction once again. This is that movie's analogue to that, and that's the great thing about The Bad Guys overall for me. It's an animated film that embraces that fact. It's a movie that doesn't feel ashamed of being animated. Complementing the animation is a very well chosen voice cast, especially Sam Rockwell. I'm an enormous fan of Sam Rockwell, have been for decades now. He's always so enjoyable to watch on screen, and even though it's just his voice, his signature dry delivery, it's instantly recognisable, and also just makes the character so effortlessly cool. He is a pitch-perfect choice for Mr. Wolf. But also, it's a character that's not really outside of Rockwell's wheelhouse, especially lately. He's specialised in playing characters that are very morally ambiguous, to say the least, that have some kind of redemptioning or awakening in some way. So Mr. Wolf joins another set of Rockwell's characters in that particular vein. He's also no stranger to crime and caper movies. You think of something like Matchstick Men, for example, and the movie makes far better use of him than Rockwell's most recent DreamWorks Animation appearance in Trolls World Tour. That film squandered him, whereas in The Bad Guys he's front and centre and very well used. I especially like the moments where Mr. Wolf turns the charm on and the other members of The Bad Guys start claiming that he goes full Clooney, which is of course another reference to Ocean's 11, but of course Rockwell has co-starred and worked with Clooney on movies like Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Fun fact, did you know that those two were in a heist movie together? Neither does anyone else. No one remembers that movie. The other members of The Bad Guys are similarly well chosen. Awkwafina and Craig Robinson provide plenty of comic support in their roles. I love the concept of Robinson's Mr. Shark because it's so ridiculous. The idea that he's a master of disguise, even though he's an anthropomorphic talking shark that just happens to be wearing a dress and a wig or a fake mustache. Really transparent disguises, but it somehow manages to fool everyone and he can get in anywhere. I think at one point there's even a conversation with a minor supporting character that thinks he's their long lost father. It's that kind of absolute absurdity that really tickled me. Very Looney Tunes-esque, you know, the kind of Bugs Bunny disguises. Podcast host Marc Maron is also well suited to his role as Mr. Snake, who is of course Mr. Wolf's right-hand man, although I've got to be honest, I spent a substantial portion of the movie thinking it was Will Arnett, although he would probably be equally suited to this kind of role. Mr. Snake is definitely the most cynical member of the group and the most resistant to change, and that provides a lot of tension, especially over the course of the movie, between his relationship with Mr. Wolf, as he becomes increasingly convinced that he is going to be betrayed in some way, especially because he has that very nihilistic view of the world, because he literally mentions that he hates everyone, but I hate you guys the least when he's referring to the bad guys. So in that sense, that kind of just absolute hatred Marc Maron manages to channel in an amusing way for that character. I also enjoyed Richard Ayoade's performance as Professor Marmalade. Again, like Rockwell, he has an instantly recognisable voice and he brings his signature style to the table, delivering his lines in a very unusual offbeat way, which I think gives a bit more dimension and personality to the character that for so much of the movie is written as a goody two-shoes, preaching love and kindness to everyone. And Ayoade's deliveries makes that kind of feel a little bit strange and alien, especially in relation to the bad guys, which is how we often see this world from. And so Ayoade's performance is definitely amusing, but also you can clearly tell that he's having fun with a role that's a little bit different to what he usually plays. And also, I think that his casting makes more sense as the story progresses. It's also refreshing to say that Zazie Beetz is actually well utilised for a change. So often I've complained about her being squandered, but this animated film of all places is actually her best movie role in quite a while. She voices the governor who becomes the love interest of Mr. Wolf, but the character is actually expanded far beyond that, and also it's not a throwaway thing like a lot of animated movies usually do. The way that Beetz and Rockwell deliver of those lines and the way those scenes are animated, it does feel like those characters have a lot of romantic tension, far more so than you would usually see in a movie like this. At times, it does feel kind of playful and flirtatious, and I think that comes down to the fact this movie is, again, taking its cues from crime films aimed at older audiences and distilling that for a family audience. You think of something like Out of Sight, to again give another Clooney reference, it's that kind of dynamic. So that immediately stood out to me, but then the direction they took that character in, I actually thought that the governor was one of the most memorable parts of the entire movie. The film's script is also very sharp and very witty. It's very self-aware of itself and it keeps the gags coming. It never feels like the movie slows down. It's always constantly making sure that something's happening, or it's adding a plot twist on top of a plot twist. There's definitely a lot of turns that will keep the audience on their toes, especially younger ones. It's nothing that you haven't seen before as an older audience member, but certainly it does feel like it has, again, a bit more sophistication than you would usually see for a family animated flick. And I do think that there are things about it you could probably poke at and go, that doesn't entirely make sense. The thing that sort of bugged me while I was watching the movie is that, of course, you have these anthropomorphic animal thieves as the protagonists, but there's also animals in the movie that don't talk, like guinea pigs or a cat that needs to be rescued out of a tree. I'm not sure what separates them or how that kind of works in this film's universe, but that is a minor nitpicky thought. For the most part, though, it does seem like it's very well thought through, especially with those aforementioned plot turns, which actually double back onto themselves, and you go, actually, those do make sense. Those do actually add up overall. It's not simply there for just keeping the action moving, which the movie does very well. Obviously, there are a few concessions for younger audiences. There's the obligatory fart jokes. When Mr. Piranha gets nervous, a running gag is that he rips these enormous smoke bomb farts that knock people out, and there's characters calling things butts, tee-hee. And like a lot of films aimed at younger audiences, the climax of the movie does turn into frantic chaos and just throwing a lot of stuff on screen. For my money, the third act, I think, does lose sight of the heist elements a little bit in amidst all of that, although it does try to keep it integrated in the fact that the last third of the movie is also about them stealing an object, in this case, a meteor, and that meteor is kind of important in its own way, in the sense that it is the most overtly sci-fi element in the movie. There's actually quite a bit of sci-fi in the books that this originated from, but a lot of that has been dropped in this film incarnation, presumably because adding aliens amidst all this would have been especially graceful, and I imagine that they're saving that kind of angle for future sequels. But also, that meteor is a very obvious piece of symbolism because it's shaped like a massive heart, and I think, like the characters in this movie, the movie definitely looks like a bad guy on the surface, but then it really has a genuine, sincere, honest beating heart at the centre of it. It has a positive message overall. Like a lot of children's media, it professes the message of not judging a book by its cover, and the bad guys try to work around their frustrations of feeling like they've been prejudged because of who they are, and that they feel that they have to really kind of maintain what people already think that they are, and how they can actually transcend that. And I think that will resonate with its target audience, that they can change and be positive. Even though the film does get a little bit messy towards the end, you end up being quite endeared to the movie overall and able to forgive some of those flaws. I was very much charmed by the bad guys. I thought this was a very enjoyable surprise. I thought it was fast, slick, and clever, and incredibly assured about itself, especially in terms of its animation, which I thought was jaw-dropping at times and always looked fantastic, but also in terms of the heist movie elements that they've incorporated into the script, but also the voice acting. Rockwell, Ayoade and Beetz are standouts in this film. I think it's a genuinely fun movie that will be enjoyed by both kids and their parents, but on slightly different levels, and I think the way the movie is so tightly written will be especially appreciated by older audiences. So if you're a fan of movies like Zootopia, for example, this is probably one for you, and I think that Perifel is definitely a director that will be one to watch, especially at DreamWorks in the future. If you like this review, then you can buy me a push pop at my Ko-fi page, or you can crack open my safe at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Burke, fading out.